listening to The Adventuring Party, talking about gaming the Irish way. This past weekend, Gaelcon, Ireland's premier gaming convention, celebrated its 33rd year. We sent along Warlord Scarr to join a panel discussing the early history of the con, how it came to be, who was there at the start, and how its legacy is carried on into the 21st century. Names will be dropped, tea will be spilled, and secret histories revealed. Grab a pint, settle back, tune in, and enjoy.
Okay, sick. So, hey everyone, welcome to the brief history of Gaelcon. We're going to see how brief we can keep it. This is going to be the first panel of Gaelcon 33, the second online Gaelcon, and yeah, it's going to be pretty exciting. So, the panel is going to be quickly about where Gaelcon started, where the IGA started, maybe as a little bit of context, and how Gaelcon is going to progress through the years. I'm Rian. I use they them pronouns. I have been involved in Gaelcon for only the last 4 years, so I'm here to provide a little youthful energy to kind of cut through the age of cheese that surrounds me. But I will let I think the other panelists introduce themselves real quick. So yeah, off we go.
Hi everyone, I'm Shane, he, him. I'm representing the Adventuring Party podcast, who are another horrific cancerous growth off the IGA. So we're just in our position as people who know people and are also kind of old. We thought we'd help support this very virtuous venture of telling people how it used to be good back in the old days.
Sick, fantastic. So, Dave, we'll go to you next then, if that's okay.
I'm Dave Rowe, he, him. My first Gaelcon was the first, 89, and I stayed, I suppose, involved in the IGA and Gaelcon until about 2000-ish, I suppose. Although I have been a gamer ever since, but since then I've just been an attendee, but I was there for the first 10 years or so. Where I met Brian.
An excellent segue. Brian.
So I'm Brian Nisbet, he, him. I started going to Gaelcon in 92. I started running games all Gaelcon long by 94. Committee from 98 to 2005. I chaired the event 20 years ago this weekend. So Gaelcon 2001. I chaired, stopped being actively involved in the committee in 2005. And then, 2 or 3 years ago, I got back involved in sort of the organization of the convention to a certain extent as the charity auction MC.
Yes, very true. So then, Oisin, we'll go to you last but not least.
Hi, so I got involved in Gaelcon in 2000, and I jumped pretty much headfirst into doing stuff. I was GMing events all weekend in my first Gaelcon, and I think 2 or 3 years later, I was on the committee, and some number of years later, which I'm not entirely sure what that number was, I ended up running the convention sometime in the late 2000s. Rather than the 20 teens. About 5 years ago or so, I finally stopped my active involvement with the IGA because I had managed to get burnt out of everything in my late 20s, I think, which possibly says something about how stressful it was running stuff. But talk about that and maybe a few other of the side projects that the IGA ran during my time there as chair and treasurer and secretary and a bunch of other stuff.
Hell yeah. I feel it pertinent to kind of to bring up that I was born in 1997, just as a, for no reason in particular. I just think it's relevant. Anyway, Let's start. Let's start. I think at the beginning. It's probably the most reasonable place to begin any discussion. With how was Gaelcon started? And I realize I don't even know the answer to this question. This isn't a story I've heard at any point. So how was Gaelcon started? Whose idea was it? How did it happen? Take it away.
I could probably answer that one because I think I was there from the very beginning. So definitely it was started by a person called Tom Roach, who is still a gamer but isn't really involved in the IGA anymore. But he had worked for Games Workshop for a short period, and then he worked in a Virgin Megastore. And I think he was still in the Virgin Megastore when he had the idea that Dublin or Ireland should run a games convention that wasn't associated with any particular college, because at that stage there was cons in Trinity and UCD and UCC and Galway, so there were always college cons, but there wasn't one that wasn't associated with the college, and that's what he wanted to do, is to have a sort of a national games convention. And he met up with a bunch of people, mostly, it has to be admitted, people from colleges in Dublin, and suggested this idea. And from that, the IGA was formed. It was specifically formed to run the convention, although almost immediately we thought we would do more than just run the convention, and we would try to be an association of people who are interested in gaming in Ireland. And I think from the very beginning, there was always a kind of like a Dublin focus, but very much it was about running the convention from the very beginning. And I think that would have been 88. And we decided that we would try to run the convention as quickly as possible. And we picked the October bank holiday weekend of the following year as being, when we would begin. And to give the very quick summary of that first convention was successful in that quite a number of people turned up, but it was also a total financial disaster because we booked I booked Simmons Court in the RDS as being our convention center without realizing just how expensive that was going to be and how little money we were actually going to take in the door. So for those first few years, very much the IGA was concerned with clearing a massive debt that we had accumulated in the very first year's convention. And I think 1990, 1991, 1992, 1993, we were still burdened by debt, and very much sort of trying to clear that as quickly as we possibly could. And that we did. And I think by 94, we were back in the black again, which I think, Brian, was when you would have become involved at that stage as well. But it was like very much a con-based thing at the very beginning, and our grand plans that we would have had at the very beginning of doing other things like running a magazine, running an association, were kind of swamped by the fact that we had made this total financial disaster at the very beginning. But fairly rapidly, we were back in the black again, and it became much more successful over that period of time. And I always felt like at the very beginning that that sort of the fact that we were so careful with money at the beginning made us then, in the years, I think, what I would think of being 94, 95, 96, 97, much more successful in terms of actually running a convention, getting good guests, having something that, people could be proud of. But it was kind of like born out of kind of a baptism of fire at the very beginning.
Did the IGA do a lot of fundraising back then to try to get rid of that, or was it mainly about managing the venue choices from then on?
Yeah, kind of. What we did was we ran things like pub quizzes, and we ran sort of like small one-day cons that were specifically done to raise money. We gathered stuff together from terms of trade stands. We invited people who we thought might actually be able to make money at the event and do things like that. So a lot of I actually pulled out sort of some old folders of mine of minutes and notes from those early meetings, those early committee meetings. A good 3/4 of them are talking about money and how we could possibly make money, how we can make money off the con, how we can make money from fans, how we can get sponsorship for everything we possibly can. A lot of it, and a lot of small things that we did at that stage were specifically done to raise money, but it was always around gaming as well, But that was very much the focus of those early days, and it was it only really became fun around sort of 93, 94 kind of time and I think it was 94 was when we had Steve Jackson as a guest and Greg Stafford as a guest. No, was it? No,
93.
93. Okay, yeah. The years kind of blur together when it's 30 years ago. But that was when it started to get fun. So that must have been the first year in the black then.
One of the things that occurs to me about an awful lot of this, in terms of like fundraising through doing great and massive enjoyable events, is given the amount of hour you put in, you might actually be better off getting a second job stacking shelves in Tesco and just putting that money into the event. It was always one of the jokes we had. It's like, just get a second job and do that to raise money. But
I mean, it wouldn't be
as much fun.
Wouldn't be as much fun as putting hundreds of hours into, because you're not allowed to drink while stacking shelves in Tesco's. You are allowed to drink during committee meetings. This is a very important point.
It's a fair point. You also don't expect to put quite as much blood, sweat, and tears, all three literally.
I think, Dave, it was fascinating because when I first went in 92, so I was 15 by October 92, and I had people had talked, I'd seen the flyers and all the rest, and talked about Gaelcon, and I'd been to a Leprechaun in Trinity, and just by that point in time, of course, the convention had moved to its first long-term home in the Royal Hospital, because it was Riverside was 90. So the venue downgrade was pretty impressive from the RDS to Riverside.
Which was almost free.
And then it was the RHK 91. So the Royal Hospital Cumanum, which unfortunately was stolen from us cruelly by the Irish Museum of Modern Art, which is now its permanent home. I remember walking in that door and just seeing the hall, the great hall in the RHK, just full of people and games and trade stands and all of this kind of stuff. And it was a huge, it was so much bigger in concept than Leprechaun, even if the numbers were bigger, absolutely, but it just looked so much more at that point, walking in that door. And I know for me, it was just, I walked in, and I'm a joiner, I realized this, but I walked in and went, I need to be part of this. How do I get involved in this? How do I do things? What are all these people who are making all these games, who are doing all this stuff? And it was just such an enthusiastic crowd of people from day one, I think.
It was definitely an inflection point around that time. What year was Magic?
92, 93. So
right. So here I have a letter.
93 came out. 94. It was huge. We had the Wizard, Watsy, Jared, and all the crowd.
So this is 94, right? So this is the letter from the Wizards of the Coast saying that they will come and they will sponsor a bunch of shit, which must have been 94. It's not dated, but I know it was that year. And we had been in touch with Wizards before they had Magic, right? So they were already a games publishing company before them, but they're a tiny, tiny little company. And when they took on Magic, they suddenly had become big. And because they kind of knew it, they decided, we sent them this trade pack saying, will you sponsor the badges? Will you sponsor the program? Will you do this, do that? They came back and said, yeah, we'll do all that. And we were like, shit, we should have asked for more, because they had so much money at that point. And it was very much an inflection point, because when you're sort of like, we had scrambled for money for a long time, but not only like us, but Ireland was poor at the time. Like, people were out of work. There was massive unemployment. Nobody really had much money to spend. Not only that, but gaming was a much smaller thing. And Magic injected money into the hobby in a way that has never really been there before, because when the Wizards people arrived, even in that first year, they had money to burn, and they had money to burn for several years after that, and spent quite a lot of it at Gaelcon. They were actually fantastic to us. They were really nice people. They were great fun, and they spent money like there was no tomorrow. So it was a kind of an inflection point where suddenly we went from being this scrabbling thing to being not well off, but certainly money became much less of a problem, and we were able to get guests and stuff like that in a way that we hadn't really been able to before. And traders who previously had been selling like RPG books and maybe a few figures and stuff like that at the stand, now suddenly people were buying cards all over the place, and people had money to, not exactly to burn, like I say, but there was certainly a lot more spending money in the hall, and that made a big difference to what we could do at the time. And it certainly suddenly felt like, oh my god, this is actually successful. And our American guests that came over at the time. I remember like Pondsmith. I don't know what year that was either.
94, 95, yeah.
God bless their memory, Brian. I remember him coming over and saying, "This is really impressive," and he compared it to sort of big cities that had conventions in the US, like not the really big ones like Gen, but cities that had conventions like Chicago. I don't know what the Chicago Con was, but he compared it to ones like that and said, "This is more impressive actually than those large cities in the US." We're like, wow, we're actually doing pretty well at this actually at the time. It certainly felt like we'd done something good at that point.
I mean, I think one of the big things with those guests, because for those who don't know him, Mike Pondsmith is a big black man. In the early 90s and mid 90s in Ireland, he stood out. It was like this was a white convention. I mean, I'm not saying that's changed massively now, but that's a different conversation. Pondsmith is this tall guy. He's 2 meters, something like that tall. He's and
very charismatic.
During teardown for the closing ceremony, there was a game of Twister, I think, taking place in the middle of the Great Hall as well. And Pondsmith was there with a pint of Guinness, which had magically appeared. There was even a bar on site. Pint of Guinness had magically appeared. And he was just, I remember him standing in the middle of the hall just going, "I love this con," because the guests were just made to feel so welcome. I think it was Mike, Pat, but anyway, the whole thing is the guests were made to feel so welcome, and they were just embraced as part of the family from the moment they stepped off the plane.
It was good for us as well, because I think I see somebody in the chat there mentioning Mark Gascoigne. So this is a postcard from Mark Gascoigne. I think the first year that he was a guest. And he was like, he wasn't necessarily a big name, but he was invited to a lot of conventions because he was like he had been a Games Workshop person, but he'd also was fairly prominent writer and had done a lot of RPG contributing kind of stuff. So he got invited to a lot of conventions, and wherever Mark went, he talked up Gaelcon, and he would be from everywhere from Australia to South America, and he would sell Gaelcon as being a fantastic experience wherever he went. And so it was kind of like the symbiotic thing where we would write off to people and say, "Would you like to be a guest at our convention?" Go, "Oh yes, absolutely," not realizing that we perhaps weren't as big as perhaps they thought, or that as the likes of Mark had told them, or indeed Steve Jackson or Greg Stafford, who did exactly the same thing. Everywhere they went, they said, "Oh, you should go to Gaelcon. It's fantastic." And then eventually to WarpCon as well, which also was we had a kind of a joke of rivalry for them for a very long time. But in a way, the Irish conventions became something that people wanted to do for a period, especially in the early 90s or mid 90s.
A question has occurred to me real quick. First of all, I, as the person who was tasked with trying to get special guests to this convention, I deeply envy your ability to get such huge names. But a question occurred to me, which was how important do you think Gaelcon was to kind of setting up the Irish tabletop gaming scene? To what extent did it exist prior to Gaelcon? Obviously it did, because, there's people involved in gaming to set it up. But how important was it in the development and, bringing us, to somewhere where we are now, or over the course of, the 2000s, etc. Or if anybody has any thoughts on that, maybe this is an inane question.
I think we're all waiting for. I'll talk, but somebody else might want to jump in there. I think we could overstate it, because in '89, I think we ran something like 15 tables of AD&D that year, which is 15 tables times 6 people, which doesn't seem like a huge number, but those people were already playing games, and they turned up at what was relative a completely new convention then. And in 1991, where I don't think we could say we made much of a difference, we just apart from gathering people together, we would have seated maybe 25 or 30 tables times 6 people plus GM for those larger role-playing events. So there was already a lot of people were playing role-playing games before that. I think what it did perhaps was it brought people together and maybe helped them to make connections with each other in a way that possibly wouldn't have happened either. But I don't know, people sort of decided to play role-playing games or any games because of Gaelcon.
I'd love to hear from Shane and Oisin on this, but I know for me, I was playing a game it was second at D&D, because of course it was. in the early 90s when and at that group of people, I was like, there's these things called conventions. There's more people to go. And I went, and the rest of the group didn't. They weren't interested. They were perfectly happy to play their tabletop game with friends, and that was it. I went to the con, and I mean, I'm looking at the list of people who were even on this call, and I mean, unsurprisingly, I met a lot of them through Gaelcon, but some of them were incredibly good friends. And then one of them was my wife. All met through conventions, so it wasn't so much about starting to play role playing games because of it. It was that new world, that was a much bigger world.
I'll certainly say that for me, I always saw, because Gaelcon was basically my first convention too, 2001. I sort of stumbled in Halloween 2001. I think wait, actually, hold on. Maybe I had to wait till 2002 because 2001 was my 18th birthday. Wait, sorry.
You started in college the year before me, which means you started in 2001, which means that if you were with DU Gamers then going to Gaelcon that year, it was 2001, otherwise it was 2002.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to remember because I don't want to mix up.
It was 20 years ago.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But yes, no.
Best Gaelcon ever, obviously.
Well, all I will say is that I very much considered Gaelcon and conventions like it as this vital networking thing, because I came into college having basically just barely heard that, games like this were a thing that existed. I had managed to, I think I, by this point, met like 2 people total in the entire county of Donegal who knew what a Warhammer was. And one of those people was a person who made Warhammers in a forge. So...
Yeah, so my first contact with conventions was reading an article in White Dwarf written by one of their contributors about a leprechaun in the mid to late 90s. And my first thought was it refers to Dublin University gamers. Now, Dublin University was not a phrase that I was familiar with. Because I was a kid, and the technical arrangements of how the University of Dublin Trinity College is structured was not something I was familiar with. I was like, Dublin City University, University College Dublin, or Trinity College Dublin are the big ones. What's this? And so I didn't follow up on that. But I was involved in specifically wargaming. I played Warhammer a fair bit. And I came to Trinity, and I got involved in DU Gamers, and my involvement for the first quite a while of involvement in cons was involved in running them before I ever attended one as a punter. I think I was 5 years. No, that's not quite true. No, it was 5 years where I wasn't involved in either running one or organizing a group trip to go to one, because WarpCon was the first one I attended as a punter, but I was still herding 50 cats to get them there with the DU Gamers trip. So I had a very, what should be an odd experience, but I suspect, and I can see a few nods going around, that this is not a completely unusual experience. It's probably not the most common experience, but it is common. So in the early 2000s, I think there was an era of slightly possibly declining budgets in terms of things like guests and so on. That was certainly something that I saw while I was in college, was like, we can have a guest if the college pays for the guest, but our take through the door is declining and we can't get people to do it because they can get their games. Now there are shops that are like permanent things made of brick and mortar that they can just walk into and buy things and then leave again. So they don't need to come to the cons. I think that's a sort of and Dave mentioned an inflection point in the early 90s. And I think the 2000s were another inflection point where cons had to make themselves about something you couldn't get couldn't just go into a shop and buy the game. And you couldn't get it around your sort of daily, your weekly games table. And that was sort of an interesting change point there, is that
what?
The something more than just your weekly games night was something that that got talked about a lot when I was involved in things.
Yeah, because that's actually, speaking of inflection points, I think another thing is this might have been one of those crisis opportunities type situations, because I'm pretty sure around about 2001 is when that Virgin Megastore, where all these, Tom Roach originally came from and got his, presumably his early gaming swag. I believe that Virgin Megastore closed around 2002. And that's about when the time like Sub-City started up. And what was the other one?
There was the fourth place
there was fourth place
shop,
and there was that little place at the bottom of it. Yeah, this is when stores were starting to develop, but there was a shaky period. There was a couple of stores came up and fell back down again in the 2003 to 2008-ish period, before we had Gamers World become really permanent.
Yeah. I think, and one of the things I want to talk about, because you talk about the games and what was there and the special games and all the rest. And one of the things I think that has changed, and this is not a qualitative statement in any way, shape, or form, but Dave alluded to it as well. And we talk about the history of the con, was the shared experience of playing a particular scenario, because you would have, I never experienced quite 20 tables, but certainly 15 tables of AD&D, as was Call of Cthulhu, Vampire the Masquerade, which paranoia. And then you'd have a lot of paranoia, and you'd try and put them in a room somewhere where they could sing "Glory, Glory, Hell Computer" on their own. But you had these numbers, and you would have, like, even small games might get 3 tables of 6 people, but you'd have the big games, you'd have so many people playing this. And first of all, you'd have to get the GMs, which was a pain in the proverbial. My first committee position was RPG coordinator. I went away to Edinburgh for 3 months during the prep for the convention. Lied to Tom Roach, who was that year's con director, a lot about what state I was in with collecting RPGs and contacting GMs, but it was all sorted. It was fine. But you would stand there with a sheet of names with the last recorded phone number that somebody had, and you would ring down through that list of names to try and find the people to get them to say yes to running in a table or two of a game. It might be an old flat of theirs. It might be their parents' house. It might be something else. You were ringing through all of these different numbers, and then you would try and get it out to them in advance. And of course, you weren't emailing anything to anybody. You were, in fact, when Tom Roach was working in marketing, used as a regular drop point. You get them printed. Dave had a decent job, I think, where he could get printing done. Other people printed, leave them for people. And then you'd run the game. And I remember myself and Nick Huggins with the first of our trilogy of vampire games, and just the number of people who talked to us about how their table had gone. And you knew there was 70 plus people who'd played this game in different ways. And the things you could do on that was just, was fantastic. And it's one of the things I miss now, because I remember Gar Hanrahan coming back from his first American convention and saying, they don't do it like that over there. Everyone just runs a single table of a game, the Creator, which gave a much more regular experience. But because also what you were doing, you'd rung all these GMs, and then of course the same way at the con, you'd be like, hi, I need you to run this game. You know this system.
It starts in 5 minutes.
It starts in 5 minutes. Have fun. That still happens, obviously, but it was a big thing. And it was just that whole change. That was such a huge thing, especially at Gaelcon, which had the big numbers that people would talk about and people would experience.
I think what was different then as well, I believe anyway, was especially in the 90s, people played lots of different stuff. People arrived, they played in a role-playing scenario, but they might also play a figure game. They might also play a board game. And then later they would play card games as well. I think it seems to me now when I go to conventions that people are much more one thing or the other. You know, people are, I'm a board gamer. No, I don't do that. Like RPGs are for kids, or whatever, or figure games are for nerds. You know, the people are much more sort of vertically kind of arranged now than, because then people were just, I'm a gamer and I'll try anything that arrives. You know, if it's in a game shop, I'll give it a go, sure. And people did do one thing more than the other. There was an awful lot more sort of cross-pollination because the hobby was smaller. So if you were a gamer, that's what you did, and you would try different things, different ways, which I kind of miss now. I mean, I know I have a wall of board games behind me, but I still consider myself at least a gamer. That would be like wider than that.
Yeah. I still feel like when I was getting into the hobby in the 2000s, that was still sort of the aspiration that I expected. I just sort of assumed that, oh, well, I'm going to have a Warhammer army, and I'm going to have a couple of RPGs, and I'm going to have the stacked board games. And that just became tougher and tougher to, well, partly maybe it's because people can't afford big flats anymore.
House prices as a direct thing. And I mean, I think we talk about, and it's worth kind of talking about going through some of this, because obviously the venue changes were a core piece of some of the excitement of the con as well. So, there was between 89 and 97, there were 3 venues for the convention. It was the RDS, there was the Riverside Club, and then there was in the RHK for a long time. And, it seemed like it was going to be there forever. And it had its own quirks, its own rooms. It had LARPs in the kitchen, which was this kind of open area, which people were walking past, but it was slightly separated, all of those things. And then we were kicked out. In 98, we went to the Burlington, which was very fancy for us. And that had its, we had these big rooms, and they hadn't let out one of the rooms. So they gave us this third of the ballroom for the charity auction and for the pub quiz all of a sudden. Oh, no, sorry, the pub quiz was outside, and then they gave us the big room for the charity auction when they realized they weren't using it for anything else. 99, we went to Croke Park, where they just opened the Hogan Stand Exhibition Center. And the comedy of errors. We had these small rooms, basically corporate boxes for some of the LARPs. There was a LAN party, as we had a few years, 98, 99, and we had LAN parties there, and they had gamers. You were allowed smoke inside at the time. They had gamers who were tipping ash onto the newly laid floors of these amazing rooms because they weren't giving us enough ashtrays. The cleaning company sprayed cleaning stuff over people's pints. They didn't give us enough ashtrays until the final night, when we were moved into a very small room because they were setting up for a banquet for a bunch of people who'd just been running the Dublin Marathon on the Monday, and they are having this gala dinner, and they put ashtrays out everywhere all of a sudden on the Monday, and not realizing that the people were running for cancer and lung cancer charities and stuff like that. So suddenly ashtrays were everywhere. Thankfully, we didn't pay them the full amount of money because we held it back, and then they never asked it for us. It was terrible. That was a nice cash injection. And then 2001, we went to 2000. Then we went to Croke Park for the first time. Not Croke Park, to Clontarf Castle for the first time. And again, a different venue, this big hall again, and rooms downstairs, and all of these other things. Suits of armor.
It was such a magnificent place to hold a games convention. Like, it looks the part. It was a pain because it turns out 3 meters of granite will block a radio signal real good.
No kidding.
You're trying to communicate with someone over the thing, and it's like, but you're the other side of a medieval wall. Good luck.
It was, and that was also one of the first times it was Magic was still huge at that point in time. And in the RHK, Magic had been in the kitchen, just kind of in the room, which was downstairs, but it was a big open room. In Clontarf Castle, they were in a room downstairs, and that kind of started some of the feeling of ghettoization in regards to some of the Magic players, because they were came in, played Magic, left again at that point in time. And that was this interesting influence, at that point. But the reputation of the con continued to grow. Obviously, 99 in Croke Park, we had Justin McKillie the author of Vampire, hugely influential in that whole area, who famously was left burning in a skip in Ballymun after a party. He walked back to his B&B after a party on one of the nights, and the following morning, no one knew where he was. He eventually turned up. Stories started growing that he was left burning in a skip, and he still remembers that, and will still talk us up to anyone who will listen. I joined a mailing list one time, and he was on it, and we were doing intros, and he was like, "Brian's cool. He knows how to party." It was this great thing, and that's the guest thing has kept on going.
Actually, for best guest story of all time is Steve Jackson, who is, if you've ever seen this guy, like he's about 5'2", right, and a very bearded Texan, and he was in Fibbers dancing, and he had a what was it, like a dictaphone, and he taped the music in Fibbers, going, "I must find out what this music is. It's fantastic." The man was completely out of his head. But he fit in right well, actually, in Fibbers. One other thing I read, in terms of differences between then and now, or at least what I see when I walk into conventions now, is people playing our role-playing games back then were mostly secondary school students. Yes, like college-age students as well, but a good half of them would have been much younger. And like they came to play role-playing games because they played them in school. And I don't think that I see that so much anymore. It seems to me that role-playing games certainly seem to be an older crowd, that everyone's sort of like grown up and got that much older. It seems to have moved up a generation in a way that I don't remember it being back then. It was certainly like, it was very much a school age thing in a way that I don't think it is anymore. Maybe that's an impression that I just have now that's incorrect. I don't know. Probably you guys who are more involved in the scene today would be able to correct me.
I'm kind of at the most immediate point of that generation. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've just left college after being in. I just have to check real quick. Is everybody here in this panel right now? Is everyone from Gamers? Because I was in Gamers. And I believe DU Gamers, specifically Trinity Gaming Society. Yeah?
Yeah.
Hell yeah. You love to see it. Anyway.
Treasurer, chairperson, secretary.
Yeah, I was treasurer twice, president once. Look at us go. Anyway, I think, so in the college right now, like in DU Gamers at the moment, RPGs are definitely the most popular thing that's played, more so than anything else. But it comes in waves. D&D in particular is going through a renaissance at the moment. I think that's kind of common knowledge. But it goes in waves. I've heard of the society, and when I speak of the society, I'm kind of using that as a stand-in more generally for college-age gamers. Kind of maybe 18 to 25 or what have you. But there was a time where the college was really all in on Magic. I don't know if we've ever been all in on war games, but war games are hard to do in a college society when you're underneath a train station and have not enough space for multiple tables.
Yeah,
So
the
society
problem
was just a long time ago.
Yeah. So the thing was, when that room was entirely dedicated to gamers, it was quite possible to have two war games tables running at once, and two 4-player war games tables running at once. And I've done that back 20 years ago when I was in, or not quite 20 years ago, just when I was in college. But unfortunately, the full unrestricted use of the room is not the thing anymore. And I think that's sort of also a thing that always happens is you deal with the situation that's in front of you. You deal with the systems that the space and available resources that you have. So 10 years ago, LARPs were huge. 15 years ago, war games and L5 Ward in particular was huge. So it just goes in waves, and what's popular will change. So
I realize we've moved a scooch away from Gaelcon. So just to bring us back on, as much as I would love to talk about the history of DU Gamers,
Panel at Leprechaun.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I'll see you on that one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, sure, exactly. We'll run this again. Anyway, but kind of as we're coming up to maybe like a little Q&A section here in in the next couple of minutes. But so I am interested to hear to what extent, and we maybe spoke about this briefly at the very beginning, to what extent everybody here still involved in con? What's your relationship in a minute, having been involved and having done stuff for it? What's your relationship to the con now, whether that's, in terms of actual work or in terms of a more like emotive relationship or whatever it may be? Yeah, what's the relationship to Gaelcon at the moment? Yeah, anyone, feel free to take it away.
I can start with a very simple. It's just like I still feel very mostly connected to the con, even if I haven't actually been on a committee. I always feel like coming out to support it and making sure I'm attended. It's just like just the effort that the committee goes through every year to make sure we have this big premier con. I always feel inspired by that, and that's why I always like to bring what games I have to the con whenever I can. So, emotionally, I still consider it sort of a cornerstone of Irish gaming, even if maybe the hobby as a whole has sort of matured and starting to branch out into a whole bunch of different hobbies. I still feel that Gaelcon has a place as a sort of center point, even if not everyone needs it. I still feel like it's worth keeping, and so I'm always there for it.
Definitely.
So, I mean, I think one of my proudest moments to do with gaming was having the opportunity to give a thank you speech a year after collectively Irish gaming won the Diana Jones Award. At Gen Con, I brought the award back after we won it in 2006. And the judges gave me the opportunity to give a brief thank you speech on behalf of Irish gaming, who'd won the award for the charity auctions. And so it was, those charity auctions. And again, Dave, can you remember what year, the first year? Because I mean, we need to talk about this briefly. The IGA charity auction, which started with, I think, an auction for Hamish, possibly. Or were you too drunk to remember? I mean, it was.
I can't remember years, but I remember the particular one. I remember was the one that was in the Green Lizard. Or is it the Green Lizard?
So the Green Lizard on Francis Street, where that was 97. I think that was 97, where a whole bunch of us had to escort you with all the money somewhere because it was Francis Street in the late 90s. But the IGA charity auction, which was just started with a random charity auction for a fluffy toy, then grew into this thing which has raised hundreds of 100,000 more euro for charity over the years, which I started attending when I was of legal age to go into pubs to attend, have spent worrying amounts of money on over the years. So the fact then that the IGA and the Gaelcon committee asked me to come and MC it, which I've been doing for the last few years, which is my main involvement to the con, has just been huge. But also, like Shane said, it's a cornerstone of my year. I mean, it's the October bank holiday weekend. It's been a very long time now, and barring accident or acts of God, I wouldn't miss it.
I would say just seeing a couple of estimates. We were using 250,000 about 15 years ago, so it's probably higher than that now. Frankly, I've contributed a fair chunk to it being higher than that now, including the fact that I'm here today is on the basis of that. And it was a huge thing. It was, I think, the only Irish gaming event that I made the time to come back for virtually from America twice. Because the first year, even though the con wasn't virtual, I was there virtually for the pub quiz at least. And it's a huge thing for me in that sense. In terms of actual involvement in running it, nothing other than showing up and making noises at people. It's a huge thing. It was my first introduction to GMing at conventions, and great experience. And yeah, that's still really important to me, which means anytime I hear any sort of rumors about, maybe Gaelcon won't run this year, it's like, I will. Up in arms.
I believe you've threatened to run the con yourself on more than one occasion if it didn't run, or was that?
No, it never quite came to that. But it's like, do you actually? I think it did come to that for Leprechaun, and I did run the con, and it was great. But no, that was the experience of the con is the main thing for me. It's the being there and being part of this thing is huge. And just, it's been very sad the last couple of years in some ways that it hasn't been able to be, sat behind around the bar and drinking and talking rot. But at the same time, it's also been a really it's been really good that it has been maintained even in this form, and that I was really happy to see that. So yeah.
Well, for me, like I kind of quit in terms of running it in like sort of late 90s or like early 2000s, and then I was an attendee from that point on. But I did have the rare pleasure, which I think a few more people than me have had at this stage, of bringing my children to Gaelcon for a number of years, and Noel Mitchell, who would have been another sort of founder member of the IGA and ran Gaelcon, especially in the difficult times. His kids and my kids we would bring them. Like, that was why we were going to Gaelcon. It was more to like bring our children with us, because they would come and they would play games for the weekend as well. And they would, they're now kind of like grown out of that, if that doesn't make you sound even older. But I certainly have had that sort of like two generations kind of experience with it now. So for me, Gaelcon is sort of like a thing for kids. I'm not saying it's a thing for kids, but you know what I mean? It's a thing for my kids, I suppose, is my relationship with it now, in a way that sort of like is great, because, especially because you're meeting up with other people that you've known for 30 years plus, and like, you've kind of grown up together. I'm still playing games. No, actually, I'm literally playing a game of Civilization with him this evening, and many of the other people that I would have been involved in Gaelcon with, and it's sort of like almost like a generational thing now. So that's kind of like my relationship with it these days.
There was a comment here where was it kind of about the neither floods nor riots can stop the Irish gaming. Actually, it's a particular story from the year of the flood, and the year the D4 hotel was flooded out by the river, the Dodder bursting its banks, and ended up in the RDS. And the RDS were in some ways great, and in some ways completely clueless as to what they were dealing with, because they were, obviously it's a massive venue and it's very much capable of dealing with the convention. But there was a conversation that was had with the RDS hosts, and they insisted on having, you want this bar open? Oh, this isn't a very large event. We'll need some certain guarantees from you. Oh, okay. What sort of guarantees? Well, we need to make sure that at least 500 euros goes across the bar. And the comment was, what, 500 euros per day? Like, probably fine for that. And then I was like, no, 500 euros for the whole weekend. I was like, 500 euros each? Like, I'll do my bit, but
that's Dave Gorman's Friday afternoon or Saturday afternoon. I mean, it's the same thing. The Burlow did the same thing to us in '98. The Burlow were like, "Oh, we demand certain guarantees of how much you're going to spend and all the rest." We had spent their weekends. Exceeded the weekends required take by Saturday mid-afternoon. Yeah. And then they loved the con so much that they decided to give the con director, which was the aforementioned Tom Roach, free beer on Saturday afternoon.
I'd imagine anyone who deserved it less, or who wanted it less.
The thing is, who wanted it less, but for some reason, the bar staff thought I was Tom Roach. I do not look like Tom in any way, shape, or form, but they decided to give me free beer for the afternoon. And I thought it was a committee thing.
No, they just thought you were Tom.
Yeah. Hey, that's a win. We take this.
Take it.
Absolutely. So I think that's a pretty good place to kind of park the discussion section. For the moment, I would like at this opportunity to maybe open it up to a couple questions from anybody that's in the chat. So if anybody has any questions whatsoever, or even if you want them to tell a particular story that you remember, I'm sure that can be arranged if anybody remembers it. So stick any questions that you might have into the chat. I will pick good ones if there's more than one. But yeah, while people are doing that, if anybody has anything that they want to ask, I just want to say, yeah.
No, I was just going to ask Dave and Brian, in those early years before, more Dave than Brian, but in these early years before the CCG section of cons had solidified, like, how different was it? Was there? I get the impression there was a lot more RPGs going on, but like, was there also like more war games, less war games, permanent board games out? I'm curious to see what the big main focus of difference was.
What I remember actually from like 89, 90, 91, 92, like which would have been like because Magic was like the first one that really mattered. And but yes, it was like the con was 50% RPGs, I would have said, like in terms of like people actually playing games. What I mean, 50% RPGs, and then basically Games Workshop based figure games of one kind or another, 40k and Fantasy Battle, and then filling in the rest, board games, war games. And I mean, literally war games, like actual hex and counter war games to a certain extent, although it's difficult to do over a weekend, but like say historical figure games, stuff like that as well would have filled in quite a bit, but I don't think really exists at cons these days at all. Well, actually, sorry, I can see Rob is sitting here and he runs a war games convention that's like very successful as well, but it's sort of like, it would have been integrated into Gaelcon back then in a way that it isn't now. And when Magic arrived, it was a big thing because it suddenly was more than half the convention was playing cards.
But I mean,
and people said this is ruining everything. But it was just a different thing.
I mean, I think it's important to note though that there was two things that happened at once there. So if you imagine the convention up to 93 really being tabletop RPGs, war games, and board games, so there were three things broadly speaking. In 93 into 94 kind of time, not only did Magic appear, and every single horizontal surface in the convention was covered in Magic cards, and you had to stop people. Like as a GM, it was so frustrating because people would be sorting their decks at the table, and you were like, "No, just put that away, concentrate on the game." But also, live action role playing started around the same time. And one of the things to be aware of with live action role playing was that it wasn't contained to a room back with the first games. And again, we talk about Tom Roach, we talk about Hotel Hezbollah and games like this. And these were games that covered the entire convention and people were playing all the time. I mean, when I first met Pat properly, it was at Leprechaun at a vampire LARP where like someone might be sitting at a table playing a game, and then suddenly, but be in character, and something else might happen. I mean, it wasn't these were weekend-long games. They were not contained to one room, and they were also disruptive. But I say that in a disruptive innovation way. They seemed really annoying on many levels at the time. You tried to find ways of saying in and out of character, but Magic was not the only thing changing the convention in the early 90s. And that was a big thing to try and figure out why the hell someone had a suitcase and was being pursued around the convention by a bunch of other people. As it turns out, it was because there was a nuke in there.
Yeah, it's true. I remember actually that they say here's a letter from Ashley Perryman booking his first tickets at Gaelcon for himself and Hilary Hayes, and they arrived that year and ran. What was it called? What was that, like the name or sort of thing that they ran over multiple years?
Oh, Once in Future King.
That's he's proposing in this letter that he's going to run this game that he calls Once in Future King. at that, and I think that was his first time there. Maybe he had been a previous year, but it's certainly, you're right. It became something. The thing about it was that the LARPs, or we were calling LARPs then, did not really exist in that form anywhere else, really. Like, it was a different thing that we were doing than what a lot of other people call live action role playing at that stage. And certainly it seemed that, you talk about sort of like doing something different at this convention that you can't normally do of your sort of like your weekly event or your weekly sort of meetup. And because people went ever larger and more involved kind of stuff. I ran I think a 16 table game at one stage in the RHK, and that Leonard O'Grady did the photo, he drew a picture, an individual picture for every single player in that game, and that ran over like about 5 or 6 hours, and at the time that felt like a perfectly normal thing to do something like of that kind of like of scope, but it was something that we were doing that I don't think many other places were even thinking of doing at the time. And certainly it seemed that like everyone wanted to run at the time a special event that we were kind of like, well, God, are you going to have the space for it? Are we going to be able to fit it in? You're going to be able to find the players for it. But I think what I noticed, what I think is maybe different now to then, is again, we would do this kind of crazy stuff that was sort of, a bit half-assed and at the same time, very sort of ambitious in what we were trying to do. And sometimes it didn't work and sometimes it did, but it was, we had a kind of an enormous amount of like chutzpah and whatever balls to kind of like run this kind of stuff. Whereas now I kind of go to a convention, I kind of go, I don't know if people are if this is necessarily the same sort of like ambition is on display. And I would say you certainly can in a way that perhaps I don't think necessarily people do right now. Maybe that's like, again, my sort of jaundiced kind of view.
I'm half torn between just kind of calling it there, because I think that's a very resonant kind of it was better back in the day kind of place to leave it. I don't mean that like I think it's excellent. Or there was a regarding questions that came up in the chat. There's kind of a theme that runs through a couple of them, which I think is related to what we were just talking about. Certainly reflecting on like the strengths of the past and the struggles that the past faced, the convention's past faced, like what the challenges might be for the con, or what you might envision the challenges for the con might be in the years going forward. I might be, this might be a self-interested question because I might be one of the people involved in the running of the con in the years to come. So if you're going to tell me what I should do or what traps to look out for, or what difficulties you might think that the con would run into, please let me know. Or if you can, envision the challenges.
Honest to God, I don't have enough information to give you good advice at this point. I'm too far out, and everyone else here is even further out and being involved. The only thing I would say is do something ambitious. Make something interesting happen that is different, that is, you obviously need the bread and butter of the RPGs or the games or the tournaments and all of that, because those are the bread and butter, the solid foundation. But what you get from a convention that you can't get from your weekly gaming night or popping along to a Friday night or a Wednesday night or whatever the night is in your local gaming store or games pub or whatever it is that there are 500 people or so at a in-person Gaelcon, and you can get 30, 40, 50 of them to do something crazy all at once. And that's something that just physically can't happen elsewhere. So that's what cons offer. That's the entire unique selling point of cons is critical mass.
Yeah.
So I totally agree with Oisin there. I think one of the things that I certainly learned back then was that it's not like you're putting on an entertainment for people, because the thing about gamers is, especially in a kind of a role-playing environment, is they will go with you. If you put out an idea, people will run with it. And in a way, you can get away with an awful lot more if you have ambition about running something, because if you say, let's do X, in a group of people, no matter how big it is, they will tend to actually go with you, and they will tend to fill in the cracks, and they will tend to turn it into an experience that perhaps you had not had in mind. So in fact, your ambition in a con, at a gaming con, can be enormous. And people arrive for something special as well, and they will, go with you to a certain extent that you don't get in any other environment. It's not like running a theater production where people just sit down and go, entertain me. You can think big in a way that you can't in any other environment, I think.
I mean, I think, and I would agree with all of that. I mean, conventions, it's not just Gaelcon. Conventions, like every other activity that people have, are trying to get that slice of people's time and money. And if you don't innovate, if you don't really make it clear why people should spend their time and money on your thing rather than all the other things, or indeed sitting on their couch playing computer games, which have evolved in ways that none of us could have seen when we were, in the early 90s or thereabouts, when a lot of the kind of the things that are still traditions are put in place. And conventions, especially ones that are long running, especially ones that have had people involved for kind of a while, or have had stories handed down and things like that, it's very easy to fall into traditions, to fall into modes of thinking. I need to get the shill in very quickly. Worldcon is kind of the World Science Fiction Convention, which obviously Glasgow 2024 bidding. We may be trying to do something in Ireland in 2029 as well. More on that later. Has the same problem. It's what is this con? Why do I go to it? What is the reason now? Is it just doing the same thing as it's been doing before with the same people, which unfortunately is overwhelmingly middle class white men. And there's a lot of diversity there, but it's not always evident. There's a lot of other events which are kind of being new and bright and exciting, and looking at things in different ways, which are getting more and more of that time and that money. So it's that reevaluation of why do we do the things that we do, and rejecting the term that we would have used, and Dave and I would have used in so many committee meetings back in the day. If we tried that and it didn't work. And that works over a period of maybe 5 years. It doesn't work over 25 years. So try it again. Do new, do different. Persuade people that Gaelcon is where you want to be on your October bank holiday weekend. And as I would always say, it's advertise, advertise, advertise. And when you think you've advertised enough, advertise some more. And that is that thing, to try and just blow the mind of things you can do, and that with a group of people, especially some of whom you may never have met before. And trying to get people like me, who are now at a point and going to the convention, mainly to meet people I've met at the convention before, to do something different, to get up away from the bar and go and play this new game, but also get people much younger than me to do the same thing.
The other thing is, also don't be afraid to just draw a line under things and go, actually, that didn't work. That's fine. Because one of the things that came up, periodically comes up, is someone comes up with a brilliant idea that sounds cool. They put it in the convention. There's some special event. Nobody buys into it. Nobody wants to do it. And that's fine. Because the whole point of experimental stuff is occasionally occasionally people don't want to change this activity. Give it a go, and if it doesn't work, or if there's not enough people signing up for it, just move on. Go, well, we've also got this other cool thing. Always be prepared to adapt and improvise, because one of the most damning things that I've seen happen occasionally, not often, but occasionally, is someone goes, well, we don't have a backup plan. We don't have something for, you're the one person who signed up to this 30-person event. It can't run with physically can't run with less than 5. I'm sorry. You don't then go buy. You go, well, we've got this other game. We've got this. We've got that. You give them something else to do. Always have something there. Space Whales, just from Rob, is a really good example of something that was sort of thrown in into an experience, and it worked really well and got people really enthusiastic. Conversely, when I ran Leprechaun, there was an attempt to run a choose your own collective experience version of the Walking Dead computer game, and we weren't able to set it up to the satisfaction of the people who wanted to do it, and very few of our punters were all that interested, so they left, and no one was left really out of the way. And that's sort of the good thing, is there was always something else to do. Be prepared to dust off, one of your scenario writers hasn't shown up on the day and he's got the only copy of the scenario with him. Take one out of an archive somewhere, dust it off, go, here you go, let's go. Have to improvise.
Absolutely. Sake, thank you very, very much. I think that is a strong, optimistic note to leave off the panel. I just want to say thank you very, very much for being on the panel and for taking the time at this very late hour of the night to talk with us and me about the history of this pretty cool convention. And yeah, Sake, I don't really know. I haven't moderated before. I don't know how to end one. But yeah.
That's pretty much
good, Rian.
I think that's it. Yeah. I say it's over, and now it's over. Yeah.
Well,
Thank the people who were listening as well, because without it, there's just a bunch of us talking into a Zoom session.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone who is listening. You are very good, and you have good questions and nice comments, and I do appreciate you.
On the Adventuring Party podcast, we always love to say, this party's over. It's a joke that's been bad for 11 years and hasn't stopped us yet.
I like it an awful lot. This party is over.
You've been listening to The Adventuring Party. We're a ragtag collective of desperate souls, striving for truth in a world of tabletop gone mad. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter. You can email us at party@theadventuringparty.net. Although, between you and me, the best place to track us down is Discord. Check the show notes for a link. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike version 3 license, which is like free, but with extra steps. Hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll see you next week.